Hi again. Last time I was talking to you guys, we explored how, despite the lack of ignorance that we have of God's will, God's glory, God's creativity, that we make ourselves fools by suppressing the truth, thinking we're wise, and exchanging the glory of our immortal God for the things of this world. And today I'm excited. We're going to be going through 500 years of history and a really clear example of the truth of Scripture and how it plays out as you separate God from what you think the world is like. So we're going to read again in Romans 1, and we're starting here in verse 21. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, and birds, and animals, and creeping things. And I just want to remind you, when we read that word fool in verse 22, the fool that they're talking about is a person who lives their life as though God and God's will were of no consequence. And so when we think about creation, it obviously brings up a discussion about science and how a lot of people talk about how science and creation, they don't align, that they contradict each other, that we don't need God because we've already fully described how everything works in a scientific world. But we're going to explore and see how Paul's words hold true to when you exchange the glory of God for mortal things, you lose sight and become foolish. So, in 4 generations, in over 500 years, this is what science has changed. It started as natural philosophy. This is in the 15 and 1600s, where you have people like Galileo, Newton, Kepler. They were men of faith that viewed science as worship, where they said a logical God will have logical rules, and if we make laws and describe laws, we'll see that consistency across the board because God's consistent, so the world around us will be consistent. So it was an act of worship, natural philosophy. But in that second generation, from the 16 through the 1700s, we had something called the Reformation, where we had people theologically split into where we have Catholics, Lutherans, Anglicans, and at that time, the education system, the colleges all around the world, they were heavily influenced and pretty much run by the church. And so when you have theological splits in the church, you get theological splits in the education system. And so there was an attempt, because anytime someone brought a new evidence, there would be theological debates. They said, well, what if there's a neutral phrasing that we can bring into science so that there's less theological debating? And so we know God's in this and working in creation, but we're just going to describe it in natural terms to avoid the confusion and allow these scientific discoveries to be distributed to the world. But then we get into the third generation, the 17 and 1800s. We had the term in scientific sense, they said the Enlightenment era, where you had people like Charles Lyell, Charles Darwin, where they turned this neutrality of science into full-blown naturalism, where they said, well, for so long we've described science in natural terms that what if we just exclude God altogether? What if we just say we can explain these things without God? What if there was no God to begin with? What if things came over a long period of time? And Charles Darwin came back and said, well, these animals have similarities. They all came from the same one. And when you combine those two things, you get a seemingly logical explanation of why God doesn't have to be in the picture anymore. And then we get back to the fourth generation, which is the 1900s of present day, where this naturalism has been institutionalized and has become the only lens you can view science in. It was from the 1500s of this is worship to, well, we're just not going to talk about God as much. We're going to just focus on what we've discovered, to, well, our discoveries look really good, and so maybe we don't need him at all, to this day where we say, if you bring God into the discussion, then it's unscientific. But that was never the point of science. Because at the point of science, the beginning was to display God's creation and display God's consistencies and laws in nature. But now we say we're going to worship the laws, use them as the explanation of cause, not just of observation. And now we're not worshiping God. We're worshiping something that we've created. We claim to become wise because of all these things we discovered, but we actually set aside the invisible attributes of God that have been displayed in nature and chose to say the only lens that we're allowed to look at is one that excludes God from the conversation. And so history has proven Paul's words to be true. When God is pushed aside, when we think ourselves wise, something else will take God's place in our heart. And at the end of the day, the things that in science that's taken over their hearts is the worship of creation and the worship of man-made ideas. It's instead of a creator, but it's ourselves, putting ourselves at that position. So tomorrow we're going to talk about how we're not that different than that. So my challenge is when you're looking and you're exposed to science, just remember science was never supposed to disprove God, and it never has, and I don't believe it will. But it's become over time the excuse that people have used to live the life that they want to live without the checks and balances that God has put into place. They ignored what was clear and instead held fast to the ideas that they had created. So I'm excited to jump into that and see how that applies to us tomorrow. Have a great day.